Hey everyone, welcome to the Sound Mind podcast, where we dive into the fascinating world of music psychology. I'm your host, Sophia, and as a music psychologist, I'll be guiding you through everything you've ever wondered about music. So, whether you're a music lover or just interested in the science of sound, you're in the right place. So, I know everyone is super invested in the World Cup right now. I have to admit, I'm not a football fan and I'm not as invested as everyone else, but I came across an article in The Athletic last week around the music chosen by each team. And of course, this kind of perked my ears up. So the article explored the role music is playing throughout this year's FIFA World Cup, from the songs that teams play in the dressing room before kickoff to the tracks blasting around the stadium after a goal, and also touched on the anthems supporters sing from the stands as well. Now, at first glance, it might seem like music is simply there to create atmosphere or to entertain the crowd while they're waiting for the next kind of moment of action. But the more I thought about it, I realised that the World Cup really is heard as much as it is seen. And I just really want to get into this in today's episode because the reason that this article caught my attention is because it really frames something that I've kind of always felt, but I've never really seen laid out so clearly. And that's that the World Cup isn't just surrounded by music, but it's actually actively designed through music. It described how music is now embedded into every stage of the tournament. So, like I said, from warm-up playlists to walkout tracks to goal celebrations and these stadium-wide songs that become associated with individual nations and moments in the tournament. But what stood out to me wasn't just that music was present, it's just how systematic it's become in football. Almost every emotional transition in a match now has a corresponding sound. And that made me start thinking about football as less of a visual sport and more as a kind of sonic and emotional system. See, some of the strongest memories that people have of football aren't just visual, they're auditory as well, whether that's roaring crowds, chants, or songs that define the entire tournament. So today, the questions that I want to explore are: why does every national team seem to have a song that fans immediately associate with them? Why do complete strangers instinctively sing together in a stadium as though they've rehearsed for months? And why is FIFA increasingly invested in curating the music played throughout the fan experience? But perhaps the biggest question of all: could the World Cup feel the same without music? Because when you really think about it, music isn't just happening alongside the football, it's literally woven into every part of it. So I'm telling you, that's definitely not a coincidence. Let's start off at looking at just how much music is woven into the tournament itself. Let's walk through a typical match. So let's say you arrive outside the stadium and before you've even found your seat, there's music playing. Fans are singing in the streets, local musicians are performing, stadium speakers are playing songs to build excitement. Even before the football begins, the emotional tone is already being set. As kickoff approaches, the first piece of music arrives that almost every football fan recognises instantly: national anthems. Now, they're much more than a formality. For players, singing the national anthem is often one of the most emotional moments before a match. Cameras really regularly capture these moments where athletes have tears in their eyes, their arms linked with teammates, singing every single word. And for supporters, it's a moment where individual identities kind of disappear and they're really replaced by something collective. Tens of thousands of people are united in that moment by one melody and one shared purpose, which is pretty amazing. And obviously, thinking about it, that doesn't just happen in football, but I think it's a really unique instance. We'll come back later to why singing together is so psychologically powerful, because I do want to touch on that in more detail. But it's worth noticing that the first act of every World Cup match isn't football, it's music. And then the teams walk onto the pitch. Now, that moment, in a way, is carefully choreographed. See, the walkout music isn't random either. It really signals that something significant is about to happen. It builds anticipation, heightens emotion, and transforms what could be 22 players walking onto some grass into a moment that feels more theatrical. But music doesn't suddenly stop once the referee blows the whistle either. Throughout the match, it's everywhere. Now, the article that inspired this episode talks about how FIFA has intentionally curated music throughout the tournament. Teams have carefully selected their warm-up playlists. Players often have their personal playlist in the dressing room before the match, helping them prepare mentally before they even step onto the pitch. Goal celebrations have their own songs, and there are tracks played during breaks, at half-time, after the final whistle, and also during presentations. And then there are the fans. See, every country seems to develop songs that become part of its kind of football identity. Sometimes they're original chants, but more often they're songs that existed long before football adopted them. England supporters, for example, have embraced songs like Wonderwall by Oasis. American fans have turned Take Me Home Country Roads into a post-match celebration. And around the world, songs like Sweet Caroline or Seven Nation Army have become almost inseparable from football itself. And what's pretty remarkable is that the majority of these songs were not originally written for sport, yet somehow they've become part of the language of football. And then there are the official tournament songs. So think back to previous World Cups. Chances are that even if you're not a big football fan, you can probably remember at least one of them. Maybe it's Waka Waka, Time for Africa by Shakira. Maybe it's Waving Flag by Kanan. Or maybe it's La Copa de la Vida by Ricky Martin. But interestingly, these songs often become shorthand for an entire summer. Years later, hearing just a few seconds of one of them can really transport people back to where they watched the tournament, who they were with, or how they felt. And it's almost as though every World Cup develops its own musical identity like this, which honestly is kind of what FIFA wants. In recent years, FIFA has become increasingly intentional about designing the fan experience. Music isn't just kind of filling the silence, it's helping to shape how the tournament feels overall. It's creating that anticipation, maintaining energy, and amplifying celebrations, and providing a kind of soundtrack to moments that millions of people are going to remember. Now, from an experience design perspective, I think it's so powerful. I find it super interesting because it really reminds us that experiences aren't remembered solely because of what happened. They're remembered because of how they made us feel. And music is honestly one of the most effective tools that we have for shaping emotion, and FIFA clearly recognizes that. Now, without the anthems, the chants, the dressing room playlists, the celebrations, and the victory songs, the World Cup would undoubtedly still be a football tournament, right? But would it feel like the World Cup is the larger question. I personally don't think so. So if music is everywhere in the World Cup experience, the next question is why it matters so much to us. To understand that, we need to zoom out a little bit and talk about identity. Now, in psychology, there's a concept called social identity theory, developed by Henry Tajfel, which suggests that a big part of how we define ourselves doesn't come from us as isolated individuals, but more so from the groups that we belong to. See, we're not just me, we are us, and those groups can be anything from our friends and culture to our city, our profession, or in this case, our country. But sport is one of the clearest places where this plays out, honestly, because supporting a football team is never about just watching a game. It's about belonging. When someone says, "we won," after their team wins, even though they weren't on the pitch, that's social identity in action. The success of the group becomes part of oneself. And music is one of the most powerful tools that we have for strengthening that sense of we. Now, at the World Cup, this becomes incredibly visible. A national anthem is the clearest example. So in that moment, thousands of strangers singing the same melody, often in different emotional states with different backgrounds. But for a brief moment, those differences dissolve, and the song becomes a container for identity. It doesn't just represent a country, it feels like the country. And beyond the anthem itself, songs start to take on an even more informal but equally powerful role. Fans adopt them, reshape them, chant them, and slowly those songs stop being just songs. They become symbols. So think about how certain tracks have become inseparable from football culture. I mentioned Seven Nation Army by the White Stripes, for example. It wasn't written for football in mind at all, yet its simple, kind of chant-like riff has become a global stadium signal. You hear those first notes and you already know what's coming. It's become part of football's shared language. Now, the same is true for songs like Sweet Caroline, which has been embraced in stadiums far beyond its original context. When it plays, the crowd doesn't just listen, they participate. It becomes a kind of collective performance, and at that point, the song is no longer just owned by the artist, it's owned by the crowd. And that sense of ownership is really important because once a group adopts a song, it becomes part of their identity structure. It signals membership. If you know it, you belong. If you sing it, you belong even more. And also that's why these songs tend to persist across different tournaments and generations. They're not chosen because they're new or trendy, but they already carry that emotional weight. They already mean something to the group. Now, in a World Cup context, that meaning becomes amplified because a song doesn't just represent a team anymore. It represents these different moments, a kind of shared history, and it becomes a shorthand for collective memory. And what's interesting is that this process isn't designed top down. No one officially assigns meaning to these songs, but it really just emerges naturally through repetition and socially shared experience. And once that meaning is established, it becomes incredibly resistant to change. And that's why teams and fan bases return to the same songs over and over again. They're not just choosing music, they're reinforcing identity and reactivating memory and signaling this continuity across time. But identity alone doesn't fully explain what's happening here because there are plenty of ways to signal belonging that don't involve music, right? You've got flags, colours, symbols, and jerseys. They all do that job too. But why is music so uniquely powerful in this context? Why does it feel like it doesn't just represent identity, but it actively creates emotional experience in real time? Now, to understand that, we need to move beyond identity and into something even more fundamental about humans connect, because identity explains who we are, but it doesn't fully explain how we feel it. Now, you can listen to Sweet Caroline on your headphones and understand it as a song, right? But hearing it sung by 70,000 people in a stadium is something completely different. And what changes is not just the volume, but the way that your body experiences it. Because something unusual happens when people start singing together at a scale. It doesn't just feel emotional, it feels physical. And at the center of this is synchronization. When thousands of people sing the same words at the same time, they're aligning in ways that go beyond sound. Their breathing starts to match. Their timing converges, and their bodies settle into a shared rhythm. Now, research has actually shown that this kind of synchronized activity, whether it's singing, marching, or dancing, it actually increases feelings of trust and social closeness, even between strangers. So, in other words, moving in time with other people quite literally changes how connected we feel to them. And in a stadium, that synchrony becomes collective. When 70,000 voices hit the same chorus at once, it can feel like the emergence of a single coordinated sound, rather than individual people singing separately. At that point, the brain is no longer processing hundreds of voices. It's processing one unified signal, and it naturally interprets that as togetherness. Now, layered onto this is emotional contagion. Emotions don't stay contained in individuals, they spread through groups. So if the people around you are excited, your own excitement increases. If they're tense, that tension becomes contagious too. Now, in a stadium environment where emotion is already heightened, this effect really compounds super quickly. A chant or chorus doesn't just reflect the mood of the crowd, it really is stabilizing and amplifying it until this shared emotional state emerges across the entire space. Now, there's also a physiological layer that sits underneath all of this. When people sing together, especially in repetitive and loud environments, their breathing patterns naturally begin to align as well. And studies on group singing have also linked it to the release of endorphins and oxytocin, which are chemicals associated with pleasure, bonding, and social trust. So you don't need to be consciously aware of any of this for it to matter. Your body is responding first, and the interpretation kind of comes afterwards. Now, this combination of synchronized movement, shared emotion, and physiological alignment really helps to understand why stadium singing can feel so overwhelming and emotional. It's literally a biological experience. You're still an individual in the crowd, but your nervous system is temporarily operating in rhythm with the people around you, and it's super, super amazing. And these are also moments where something else can occur, which is goosebumps. That reaction tends to emerge when emotional intensity, social connection, and unpredictability converge at the same time, when something really feels larger than what you as one person can fully contain. And it's such just a euphoric feeling in general to be able to experience goosebumps, especially in a crowd. I don't know if you've ever been at a concert or just at a large event in general and experienced that. It's honestly just one of the most beautiful experiences you can ever have. And I think just an underlying thread through all of this is that in those moments, the boundary between me and the crowd really becomes less distinct. You're no longer hearing music as an individual, you're experiencing yourself as part of this collective system. And that really helps explain something fundamental about football itself. It's not just that music is present in the stadiums, it's one of the mechanisms that allows us, thousands of people, to temporarily become one coordinated emotional experience. Okay, so up until now, we've mostly been talking about what music means in football: identity, ritual, memory, and collective experience. But there's another layer sitting underneath all of this that's more kind of immediate and biological as well. Music isn't just shaping meaning in the World Cup, it's actively helping people regulate what they feel in real time. And you start to see this most clearly when you shift focus from fans to everyone involved in the tournament. So let's talk about players for a second. For players, music is often part of the unseen preparation long before they step onto the pitch. So in the hours and minutes leading up to a match, the emotional stakes are already high. Pressure, anticipation, anxiety, focus, sometimes even fear, all competing at once. And music really becomes a way of navigating that internal state, almost like an emotional calibration tool, rather than just motivation. We spoke a lot about this with Justin Holiday in our last episode when it comes to music and basketball in particular. Now, one of its key functions here is managing arousal. The balance between being too underactivated and too overactivated. Too little arousal and a player can feel flat, disconnected, and lacking intensity. But too much and everything kind of speeds up. Decisions feel rushed, the body becomes tense, thinking becomes less precise. Now, music helps fine-tune that balance. A high-energy track might lift intensity and confidence before kickoff, while something calmer can steady the nerves and narrow focus. But in both cases, the aim is the same: to move the player towards a state where performance feels controlled but instinctive, often described in psychology as flow. Now, flow states are particularly interesting here because they represent a kind of optimal performance zone, where attention is fully absorbed in the task, self-consciousness drops away, and action almost feels automatic. Now, music doesn't create flow directly, but it can act as a kind of bridge into it by shaping physiological and emotional state beforehand. It really helps athletes shift from the external noise of expectation into the internal world of performance. Now, for fans, the same regulatory function is happening, but in a more collective and fluctuating way. So, before a match, music helps organize anticipation, turning restless energy into something shared and structured, rather than this kind of fragmented emotion. And during those moments of high intensity, it amplifies emotion, making celebration feel larger, more unified, and more embodied. After setbacks or defeats, it can soften the emotional impact, not by removing disappointment, but by holding it in a shared space where it doesn't have to be processed alone. And importantly, it synchronizes emotional experience. So, like we discussed, in a stadium or fan zone, music really helps to align what fans are feeling. Individual emotional responses tend to converge into this kind of shared emotional field. So it's no longer a purely individual emotion, it's reinforced and amplified by everyone around you. Now, what's happening here is that music is functioning almost like an emotional steering system for the tournament. It doesn't flatten the highs and lows. That would kind of take away what makes it meaningful, right? Instead, it shapes its direction and intensity. It sharpens joy, stabilizes nerves, deepens collective energy, and creates this kind of structured release. So, whether it's a player walking out into a stadium trying to regulate their breathing, or a fan in the stands holding their breath during a kind of shootout surrounded by tens of thousands of other people doing the same, music is really operating in the background, helping everyone stay emotionally aligned with the moment that they're in. And I think once you notice that, it becomes harder to see the World Cup as just a sporting event, because what's being shaped here isn't only performance or competition, it's the experience of emotion itself. Now, I really encourage you to check out the article, find out what your country's soundtrack is. What's also great is that the tracks submitted by the national teams are reviewed beforehand by FIFA's Human Rights and Anti-Discrimination Department. So any songs where the content is deemed to be offensive, inappropriate, discriminatory, or encouraging political messages are omitted. I'll link the Athletics Spotify playlist in the description if you want to listen to all the team songs together to really get in the global spirit. I absolutely loved reading through each country's signature song, warm-up song, goal music, and post-match. A lot of them are really aligned with the country's heritage and overall vibe, and honestly, I could do a whole breakdown of each song, but that would take forever. So instead, let me know your favorite country's song lineup over on Threads at the Soundmind Talks. It doesn't even need to be your own, honestly, but some of them are amazing. But really, to kind of tie everything together for today's episode, I think this brings us back to the question that we kind of started with. Could the World Cup exist in the same way without music? And technically, yes, right? The matches would still be played, goals would still be scored, and at the end of it all, a trophy would still be lifted. But I think experientially, emotionally, and culturally, it would be something entirely different because, as we've seen throughout this episode, music really does create identity, turns individuals into communities, and it gives structure through ritual and emotion. It also strengthens memory, which I think is super fascinating. And when you put all of that together, it becomes clear that music isn't just a background feature of the World Cup, it's really part of its architecture. So maybe the soundtrack of the World Cup isn't necessarily the official anthem, or even the curated playlists or songs chosen by the teams themselves. Maybe it's something much more emergent than that. It's the collective voice of the crowd, the chants that are growing over time, and the songs that get adopted and reshaped, the moments where thousands of people end up singing the same thing without ever having agreed to doing so. Because in the end, those are the kind of sounds that really become inseparable from the memories and the moments themselves. And I think there are so many layers to that, which really makes this such a fascinating topic. But that is all I have for you today. If you've enjoyed this episode, please rate or review on wherever you're listening and share it with someone who loves music or football just as much as you do, or might just find it interesting. Don't forget to follow us and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. And like I said, come and say hi over on Instagram or on Threads at the Sound Mind Talks. But until next time, keep listening, keep reflecting, and I'll see you on the Sound Mind.